Jacob had always been driven by ambition, but after marrying Claire, his life seemed to have taken a new turn. Claire was everything he wanted, beautiful, smart, and most importantly, ambitious in her own right. She pushed him to aim higher, to chase bigger dreams, and that's exactly what Jacob did. It didn't take long before his father-in-law, a wealthy businessman, offered Jacob a share in his much larger company, a business empire that dwarfed Martin's own. Jacob could feel the weight of this opportunity pressing against him. It was more than just a business deal. It was a chance to prove his worth, to prove that he could succeed on his own, beyond his father's shadow. The moment came when he knew what he had to do. Jacob looked at his father, sitting across from him in the family dining room, the man who had worked tirelessly his whole life trying to build a legacy. But to Jacob, it was never enough. He had always been trapped in Martin's world, where his father's success loomed over him like a mountain he could never climb. He had grown tired of it, tired of being the second in command, tired of his father's influence hanging over every decision he made, every step he took. Now that he had Claire by his side and his father-in-law's offer on the table, he had no intention of staying under Martin's shadow any longer. With cold resolve in his eyes, Jacob stood up. The air in the room grew tense as he stared at his father. Martin, taken aback by the sudden shift in Jacob's demeanor, instinctively knew something was coming. But nothing could have prepared him for what Jacob said next. "You're no part of our family anymore. Leave right now." Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe and like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And tell us in the comments, what would you do in this situation? Jacob's words cut through the room like a knife. Martin froze. The weight of the words hung in the air. His son, the person he had raised, had just torn the fabric of their relationship in a single sentence. It felt as though the ground had been pulled from beneath him. All those years of hard work, the sacrifices, the long hours, the endless striving to give his children the best life. None of it seemed to matter now. Jacob had thrown it all away. The shock was immediate. Martin's heart sank. It wasn't just the loss of respect, it was the complete rejection. The man he had raised, the son he had tried to guide, had turned his back on him. And what hurt the most was that it wasn't a sudden outburst. It wasn't a moment of anger. No, it was cold, calculated. Jacob had made a decision, and there was no turning back from it. For a moment, the room felt impossibly quiet. Martin's hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the edge of the table, his mind racing to process what had just happened. He had known things hadn't been easy with Jacob lately. But this was an irreparable fracture, a wound so deep it could never heal. His own son had chosen money and status over family, and Martin could feel the weight of that choice crushing him. Jacob didn't wait for a response. He was done. Done with the family that had always been there. Done with the legacy that had been built before him. He turned his back and walked away, not sparing a second glance at the father who had given everything to make sure his children had opportunities, had choices, not sparing a second thought for the years of work Martin had put into the company. Jacob had made his choice. It was time to move on. The door closed behind Jacob with a soft thud, leaving Martin alone in the room. His chest tightened. Anger swirled inside him, but it was quickly replaced by a profound sorrow. He had never imagined it would come to this, never imagined his own son would turn on him so ruthlessly. For the next few days, Martin couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. He kept replaying that moment in his head over and over, searching for answers. But there were none. Jacob had made his decision, and there was no coming back from it. As the days passed, Martin began to feel the sting of his son's rejection seep deeper into his bones. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt, and that hurt twisted into something darker, something that could no longer be ignored. He knew, deep down, that he had to do something about it. He couldn't let this slide, his life's work, his company, his legacy. He couldn't let Jacob destroy it all. Jacob thought he could turn his back on his father. Well, Martin wasn't going to let him walk away so easily. Martin's mind began to work in overdrive, planning his next steps. He was a man who had built everything he had from the ground up. Every success, every accomplishment, had been the result of years of hard work and sacrifice. And now his own son had betrayed him for a chance at a bigger fortune. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was that Jacob had no idea what he had just done. The naivety, the arrogance, the utter lack of respect. Jacob thought that because he had his father-in-law's offer, because he had money and status, he was untouchable. That was the mistake Jacob made. He underestimated Martin, and Martin would make sure that he regretted it. As Martin sat in his study that evening, he began to plan. His company was his life. He had worked too hard to let it slip away, to let Jacob's childish ambitions undo everything he had built. He would take back control. He would make Jacob see the consequences of his actions. He wasn't going to let this betrayal go unpunished. Martin picked up the phone and began making calls. He would start taking the necessary steps to ensure that his company remained under his control. He couldn't trust Jacob anymore, not with the company, not with the future. Jacob had made it clear that he didn't value family. Well, now Martin would show him that actions have consequences. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. Martin set the phone down, his mind racing. The game had changed. Jacob had thrown the first punch, and now Martin was going to make sure the next move was his. He wasn't weak. He wasn't going to let his son's betrayal destroy everything he had worked for. Martin would take control, no matter the cost. The battle had just begun. The days following Jacob's words were long and heavy. Martin had always prided himself on his composure, his ability to think and act decisively. But the betrayal, the sting of those words, had pierced him deeper than any failure in business ever had. He sat in his office for hours, staring at the framed photo on his desk, the one with him, his wife, and Jacob, before everything had turned sour. He wondered where he went wrong, but deep down, he knew the answer. Jacob had always been difficult, always wanting more, always feeling like he deserved more. Now that hunger had consumed him, and Martin was left to pick up the pieces. It didn't take long for Martin to make his decision. He wasn't going to let Jacob's selfishness destroy what he had worked for. He had built this company from the ground up, and he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers just because his son had found a bigger fish to swim with. Jacob's arrogance had blinded him to the realities of business. To him, it was all about the money, the status, the power. But Martin knew that success didn't come from ambition alone. It came from hard work, dedication, and the willingness to sacrifice. And now, Jacob had shown his true colors. He had chosen wealth over family, ambition over loyalty. Martin couldn't let him get away with it. It was time to act. Martin began to make drastic changes in his company. He called in his trusted senior managers, those who had been with him for years, and informed them of the new direction. Jacob was no longer a part of the company in any meaningful way. Martin removed him from his position and reassigned his duties to others. He could feel the weight of the decision, the gravity of what it meant, but he knew it was necessary. There was no turning back now. He pulled the strings behind the scenes, tightening his control over the company's assets. The business that had once been a partnership between father and son was now solely under Martin's command. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Martin had been the one making the tough calls, the one driving the company forward. Jacob had been riding on his coattails, thinking he was the one running the show. Well, that was about to change. For the first time in years, Martin felt a sense of control he hadn't realized he had lost. The phone calls he made, the meetings he held, all were with the purpose of cutting Jacob out completely. Martin was determined to prove that his son had underestimated him. He wasn't just going to sit back and watch everything he had built crumble. No, Martin was going to make sure that Jacob knew the consequences of his actions. But while Martin was consolidating his power, Jacob was spiraling. Jacob didn't know what to do. The lavish life he had imagined for himself with Claire was slipping through his fingers. He had thought that once he had secured the deal with his father-in-law, everything would fall into place. But nothing had gone according to plan. His father's sudden withdrawal from the company left him scrambling for a way to salvage his reputation. He hadn't expected Martin to react so forcefully. The once unstoppable confidence that Jacob had in his own abilities had begun to crumble. Without his father's influence, without the company's resources, Jacob was just another man with empty promises. He had no choice but to turn to his father-in-law, the man who had offered him a chance at the bigger game. Surely, with his father-in-law's support, he could still make a name for himself. Jacob had never been one to admit failure, but he knew he had to play the hand he was dealt. His pride was bruised, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of his own failure. He made the call. "Mr. Hayes, I need to talk to you about the future. I'm in a difficult situation. My father, he's cut me out. I'm left without any resources, any position, but you offered me a chance in your company. I want to discuss how we can make that work." Jacob's voice was laced with urgency. He had no idea what to expect from his father-in-law. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe his father-in-law would offer him a stake in the business right away, or at least help him get on his feet. But the response he received was not what he hoped for. "You're right, Jacob. You are in a difficult situation," Mr. Hayes replied, his voice measured. "I'm willing to give you a chance, but it's not going to be as simple as you think. We're not going to just hand you a share of the company. You need to prove yourself. There's a trial period first. You'll have to show us what you're made of. You're going to have to earn your place." Jacob's stomach tightened. A trial period? He had expected something more, something concrete. Instead, his father-in-law was offering him a chance, but only if he could prove himself. Jacob had expected to be treated like an equal, but it was clear now that he was just another candidate among many, subject to the same standards as anyone else. "Of course, Mr. Hayes, I understand," Jacob replied, his voice slightly strained. "I won't let you down. I'll prove myself." But inside, Jacob seethed. A trial period? Was he really being tested like this? He had thought his marriage, his family, his ties to Claire's wealth and status would give him the leverage he needed. But here he was, reduced to nothing more than an outsider fighting for a chance. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was supposed to be in control, to have everything he wanted handed to him on a silver platter. Yet, here he was, clawing his way up again, unsure of where the next step would take him. Meanwhile, Martin's grip on the company tightened. He had made the decision to go it alone, to cut Jacob out entirely, and now he was reaping the rewards. The company's assets were secure, its direction was clear, and Martin's authority was unchallenged. Jacob had believed that he could push his father aside, but Martin had proven just how deeply his roots ran. In the end, it was Martin's company, his legacy, and Jacob had underestimated the power of that. Jacob's attempts to gain his father-in-law's approval were futile. Mr. Hayes had made it clear that he had no intention of giving him a free pass. The trial period was a test, a way of seeing if Jacob had the drive, the determination, to make something of himself without relying on the connections his father had built. For the first time in his life, Jacob realized that nothing would be handed to him on a silver platter. He was on his own, and he had to make it work, no matter the cost. As the days passed, Jacob found himself isolated, surrounded by reminders of the life he thought he could have had. But instead of focusing on the task at hand, he found himself consumed with thoughts of revenge. Revenge against his father for turning his back on him. Revenge against his father-in-law for treating him like just another candidate in a sea of applicants. Jacob couldn't accept that he was no longer the center of attention. He had always been the one everyone relied on. But now, he was just another man trying to prove his worth, and he wouldn't let anyone forget it. The war between father and son had only just begun. The first day at his father-in-law's company felt like a dream, turning into a nightmare. Jacob walked through the sleek, modern office, the glass walls reflecting his every move. Everything around him screamed success, everything he had wanted for himself. Yet, as the hours ticked by, the weight of reality began to set in. His father-in-law, Mr. Hayes, had made it clear from the beginning that Jacob wasn't going to get an automatic pass. He wasn't going to be handed a share of the business simply because he was married to Claire. No, Mr. Hayes had given him a trial period, a test, and Jacob had to prove himself just like anyone else. The day was filled with meetings, phone calls, and presentations. It was a fast-paced environment, faster than anything Jacob had ever experienced in his father's company. There were no shortcuts here, no easy way to navigate through the chaos. Jacob was expected to make decisions quickly, often without all the information, and to contribute to discussions that felt way above his head. He found himself nodding along, trying to keep up, but the more he tried, the more he felt out of place. It was as if he didn't belong. It wasn't just the complexity of the work that overwhelmed him. It was the cold, indifferent attitude of everyone around him. No one was impressed by who he was or who he married. They saw him as another employee, another face in the crowd. Jacob had always been used to having power, to having a sense of importance. Back in his father's company, he had been treated like a future leader. But here, he was nothing. He was just Jacob, Claire's husband. No one looked at him with the same respect they gave others in the office. He was an outsider, and every day he spent in that office reinforced that feeling. The first week went by in a blur of meetings and deadlines. Jacob found himself struggling to make the right calls, constantly second-guessing his decisions. Every time he sat down with the team to discuss strategies, he felt more and more like an imposter. The reality of the situation was dawning on him. He wasn't ready. He didn't have the experience or the skills to run a business like this. His father-in-law's company was on an entirely different level than anything he had ever managed. But the worst part was the way his father-in-law treated him. Mr. Hayes was polite, but there was no warmth, no acknowledgement of the effort Jacob was putting in. It was clear that Mr. Hayes didn't believe in him, not in the way Jacob had hoped. There was no mentorship, no guidance. It was as though he was being tested to see if he could sink or swim, with no real effort to help him stay afloat. And Jacob had never been a swimmer. At the end of the first week, Jacob sat in his office, staring at the paperwork in front of him. He had been given a chance, but now he wasn't sure if he could make it work. His pride had taken a massive blow. He wasn't the man he thought he was. Back in his father's company, everything had been handed to him. Resources, opportunities, even the freedom to make mistakes. Here, he had nothing, and it was starting to wear on him. As he sat there, a message popped up on his phone. It was from Claire. "Are you okay?" she asked. Jacob hesitated before replying, trying to mask the frustration in his words. "Just a bit of a rough start. You know, trying to prove myself." The reply came almost immediately. "Don't get too worked up. You've got this." But Jacob knew. He knew that Claire wasn't as convinced as she let on. She had always believed in him, but the longer this trial period went on, the more it became clear that her belief was starting to fade. She had watched him fail before, but this time felt different. This time, she was watching him struggle in a place where success was the norm, and he wasn't measuring up. The weekend passed, but Jacob's anxiety didn't go away. He tried to shake it off, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach only grew stronger. Monday arrived, and with it, another round of meetings. But this time, something was different. Jacob could feel the eyes on him. The team was watching, waiting to see if he could handle the pressure. He had been given the opportunity, but now it felt like everyone was counting down the seconds, until he would fail. He stumbled through the meeting, his mind racing, his words coming out in a jumbled mess. When it was over, he felt the weight of everyone's gaze on him. There was no support, no reassurance, just the cold reality that Jacob wasn't the person they had hoped he would be. He wasn't the leader they had expected. By the time he left the office that day, Jacob was defeated. He had tried to prove that he was capable, that he could be a force in this new world. But instead, he had only proven how out of his depth he truly was. His father-in-law's indifference stung more than he had anticipated. Jacob had thought that with Claire's family behind him, he could overcome any obstacle. But now, it seemed like he was just another failure. He wasn't cut out for this. He wasn't ready. That evening, he went home to Claire, who had prepared dinner, her face lighting up when she saw him. But even as she smiled at him, Jacob could see the doubt in her eyes. She was trying to hide it, but it was there. She knew something wasn't right. She knew that Jacob wasn't the man he had promised to be. "How was your day?" Claire asked, though she already knew the answer. Jacob forced a smile. "It was fine. Just a little more work to do, you know?" But Claire wasn't convinced. She set down her fork, her brow furrowing. "Jacob, I know you're trying, but I can see it in your eyes. You're struggling, and you don't have to do this alone." Jacob's heart sank. He had always been the strong one, the one who didn't need help. But now, he was the one who needed it most, and Claire wasn't offering him the support he thought he would get. She had always been there for him, but now she was beginning to doubt him. "You don't understand," Jacob said quietly, his voice heavy with frustration. "I'm not cut out for this. I can't even keep up. It's harder than I thought." Claire looked at him, her face softening, but there was no pity in her expression, only concern. "Jacob, I know you're not used to failing, but maybe it's time to be honest with yourself. You've always been given opportunities, but now you're on your own. And that's okay. But maybe this isn't your path." The words hit him like a slap. It was the first time Claire had said anything that harsh, but it was the truth. She didn't believe in him the way she used to, and Jacob knew, deep down, that he had lost something essential, not just his confidence, but his wife's faith in him. The realization settled in his chest like a stone. He had nothing left. The father-in-law's trial period had failed him. His father's betrayal had shattered his foundation. And now Claire, the one person who had always stood by him, was starting to doubt him too. Jacob felt like a man who had built his whole identity on promises, but now all of it was crumbling. His future, once so clear, was now shrouded in uncertainty. And with every failure, he found himself sinking deeper into a hole he wasn't sure he could climb out of. The man who once had everything was now standing at the edge, wondering how he had gotten here. And Claire wasn't the person he thought she was, either. The cracks in their relationship were widening, and no matter how hard Jacob tried, he couldn't seem to fix it. He had been wrong about so much, and now it was too late to make things right. Jacob sat in the quiet of the apartment, the hum of the city barely audible through the walls. It had been 2 weeks since that last conversation with Claire, 2 weeks of silence, of tension, of mounting anxiety. He hadn't seen her smile the way she used to. She had stopped asking him about his day, stopped pretending to care about the job he was trying so desperately to keep. The small moments they once shared had disappeared, replaced by a growing sense of isolation that Jacob couldn't shake off. The reality was hard to face. He had nothing left. His father-in-law had made it clear that his place in the business was never going to come easy. The trial period, which he had hoped would serve as his second chance, had turned into a nightmare. He hadn't proved anything. The more he tried, the more he felt like an imposter, unable to fit in with the high-powered team around him. The stress had been unbearable, and the work only seemed to get harder. Each day was a new battle, one he felt he was losing. Claire, once his biggest supporter, had stopped pretending everything was fine. She had always believed in his potential, but now that faith seemed to be fading, Jacob could see it in the way she looked at him. Or rather, the way she no longer looked at him. The questions that used to come so easily were replaced with silence. The gentle encouragement had turned into passive frustration. She no longer asked him how things were going at work. She no longer made excuses for his failures. And most painfully, she stopped telling him everything would be okay. Jacob could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just his career that was slipping through his fingers. It was his marriage, his sense of self-worth. Claire had become distant, a stranger in their home. Her glances were cold, her voice clipped. The warmth that once defined their relationship had disappeared, replaced by something unspoken and bitter. One night, after an awkward dinner where neither of them had spoken much, Claire finally broke the silence. She sat across from Jacob, her arms crossed, her face tight with emotion. "Jacob, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady but lacking the tenderness it once carried. Jacob's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing her say it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. He tried to muster the courage to respond, but his mouth went dry. "Jacob," Claire continued, her eyes searching his face, "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending. We both know it's not working. You've had every chance, every opportunity, but you're still not stepping up. And I can't keep carrying you." The words cut through him, deeper than anything he had heard in the last few months. Claire's voice, once full of encouragement, now held nothing but frustration. She was done. Jacob didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say to fix this. The truth of it all was so stark, so painful. He had failed, not just in his career but in the most important part of his life, his marriage. "I didn't ask for this," Jacob finally managed to say, his voice quiet. "I didn't ask to be in this situation. I didn't ask for things to fall apart." Claire looked at him, her gaze steady but cold. "No, you didn't. But you didn't do anything to fix it either. You've been given every chance to succeed, Jacob. Every chance. But you've just failed. And I don't know how much longer I can pretend that it's all going to be okay when I know it's not." Jacob felt his stomach churn as the weight of her words sank in. He hadn't expected Claire to walk away, not like this. He had thought that if he just pushed a little harder, if he tried just a little more, he could make it right. But now, sitting across from her, he realized the truth. She had lost faith in him. And worse, she no longer believed in them. No longer believed in their future together. "I'm sorry," Jacob whispered, but the words felt hollow. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Claire didn't respond. She simply stood up, her face hard, her eyes avoiding his. Without another word, she walked out of the room, leaving Jacob alone in the silence. He sat there for what felt like hours, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. His marriage was on the brink of collapse. His career had fallen apart. And now, he was left with nothing but the remnants of a life he had tried so hard to build. The days that followed were even worse. Claire spent more time away from home, often staying late at work or going out with friends. Jacob felt more isolated than ever. He tried to reach out, to talk to her, but every conversation ended in the same way. There was nothing left to say. At work, things were no better. Jacob's father-in-law had not taken kindly to his performance during the trial period. He had been given opportunities to prove himself, but every time Jacob failed to deliver, the tension grew. His father-in-law's indifference became more pronounced, and it was clear that Jacob wasn't going to be given a real chance anytime soon. In the back of his mind, Jacob couldn't help but feel the weight of his father's absence. Martin had always been the one to guide him, to steer him in the right direction, even if their relationship had been strained. Now Jacob was completely on his own, and the harsh reality of it all was suffocating. He was running out of options. He had no job, no money, and now no wife. He had nothing left to rely on but his own fragile pride, and that was slipping through his fingers. He had spent his life chasing wealth, chasing status, and now, with everything in pieces around him, he realized how empty it all was. He had no more resources, no more opportunities. His father's company was gone, his father-in-law's business had rejected him, and Claire had walked away. Jacob was left with nothing but his own failure and the overwhelming sense that his life was falling apart. The weight of it all began to crush him. Each day felt heavier than the last, the silence in the apartment growing louder, the emptiness more palpable. He couldn't escape the constant reminder of how far he had fallen, how far he had failed. Jacob had been given every advantage, every opportunity, and now he had lost it all. There was nothing left to hold on to, no one to turn to, no one to help him pick up the pieces, and deep down, Jacob knew that he had no one to blame but himself. The quiet in the apartment had become unbearable. Jacob hadn't heard Claire's voice in days, and the stillness of the place felt suffocating. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone, his mind a whirlwind of frustration, desperation, and regret. Everything had spiraled out of control. He had failed at his job, failed at his marriage, failed at the very life he had tried to build for himself. The trial period at his father-in-law's company had ended, and it had ended badly. Jacob hadn't lived up to the expectations, and now he was on the brink of losing everything. He was living in a house that no longer felt like a home that was now as cold as the pit in his stomach. He had no idea where to turn, no one to talk to, no one to turn to for help. He had been so sure that he could make it on his own, but now, with his dreams shattered and his confidence completely destroyed, he realized he was nothing without the support he had so carelessly thrown away. Jacob knew there was only one person left who could help him. The one person he had pushed away in his moment of arrogance, Martin, his father. The one man who had always been there for him, even when their relationship had been strained. The one man who had always believed in him. His fingers hovered over the screen as he stared at his father's name in his contacts. He hadn't spoken to Martin since that fateful day when Jacob had thrown him out of his life. He had been so sure, so determined, to make his own way without his father's shadow. But now, in the midst of his failures, Jacob realized how wrong he had been. He had made a mistake that cost him everything. He took a deep breath and dialed his father's number. The phone rang, each ring feeling like an eternity. Jacob's heart raced in his chest, his hands shaking. He didn't know what he was going to say, didn't know if his father would even pick up. But at this point, it didn't matter. He had nothing left. Finally, Martin's voice came through the line, sharp and direct, as it always had been. "Jacob," Martin said, his tone cool but tinged with a hint of caution. "What's this about?" Jacob's throat tightened, the words barely able to escape his lips. The weight of everything he had done, everything he had lost, was too much to carry. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely able to get the words out. "Dad, I was wrong. I need your help," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I can't do this anymore. I've lost everything. I don't know what to do. Please, help me. I don't know where to turn." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jacob held his breath, waiting for his father's response. He knew the damage had been done, knew that he had severed their bond with his own hands, but part of him still held on to the hope that Martin would help him, that he would come to his aid, just like he had in the past. Martin's voice broke through the silence, colder than Jacob had expected. "You're right about one thing, Jacob," Martin said, his voice clipped and distant. "You were wrong, but I'm not going to help you. You made your bed, now you lie in it." Jacob's heart sank. He had been expecting something, anything that would offer him a way out, but Martin's words hit him like a slap. His father's response wasn't the one he had hoped for. It wasn't the offer of forgiveness, the hand extended to help him back up. No, it was a rejection, final and absolute. "You said, 'I'm no part of your family anymore,'" Martin continued, his voice sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Now, you're working at your new big company. Ask your father-in-law for help. He's the one you admired more, remember?" Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Martin's words cut deeper than any rejection he had faced. His father was right. He had cast him aside, treated him as if he were no longer important. Now, the truth of it was laid bare before him. Martin had no intention of rescuing him. Not now. Not after everything Jacob had done. The silence between them was deafening. Jacob felt as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. His own father, the man he had turned to in times of need, had now turned his back on him. And Jacob couldn't blame him. He had made the decision to cut ties with his father. He had chosen the path that led him to this moment of total collapse. I'm sorry," Jacob muttered, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. They couldn't undo what had been done. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have pushed you away." Martin didn't respond right away. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Finally, Martin spoke again, but his tone was final, devoid of any warmth or hope. "You think you can just come back from this? You think you can undo everything you've done?" Martin's voice was bitter now, filled with a quiet rage. "You made your bed, Jacob, and now you'll lie in it." Jacob closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his failure press down on him. His father's words felt like a final nail in the coffin. There was no coming back from this, no redemption, no second chances. "I'm sorry, Dad," Jacob whispered again, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no way to fix it. Martin's response was cold, almost indifferent. "Goodbye, Jacob." And with that, the line went silent. Jacob sat there, phone pressed to his ear, staring at the screen as if somehow waiting for the call to come back. But it didn't. Martin was gone. The last bridge Jacob had hoped to cross was now burned, reduced to ashes by his own hand. He was alone, and this time there was no one left to turn to. The truth hit him harder than anything else. He had nothing, no career, no family, no future. His life had crumbled in front of him, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. No one was going to save him. Not his father, not his wife, not anyone. Jacob sat there, alone in the silence, knowing that he had reached the end of the road. This was the sharp end, and there was no going back. Martin stood in the quiet of his office, the sun slowly setting outside the window, casting long shadows across the room. The phone call with Jacob had left him feeling strangely calm. He wasn't angry. There was no fury in his chest, no burning resentment, just a cold, unshakable certainty that he had done the right thing. Jacob had pushed him away, and now it was time for him to face the reality of his choices. Martin had spent so many years working to build a life for his family, a life that he had hoped would be passed down to his children. But now, that future had slipped through his fingers. Jacob had rejected everything Martin had tried to teach him, the value of hard work, loyalty, and family. Martin had been there for him every step of the way, offering advice, support, and opportunities. But Jacob had wanted more. He had wanted to skip the hard work, to take shortcuts, and when that didn't happen, he blamed Martin. The sting of Jacob's betrayal still lingered in Martin's mind, but he didn't regret his decision. In some ways, cutting ties with his son had been the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was also the most necessary. Jacob needed to learn the consequences of his actions. If he didn't, he would continue down the same destructive path, never learning, never growing. And as painful as it was, Martin had realized that he couldn't protect him anymore. His son was on his own. The thoughts of his son, now a stranger, weighed heavily on Martin. He thought about the years he had spent trying to be a good father, the endless hours of work that had kept him away from home. But now, he saw those sacrifices in a new light. He had given Jacob everything he could offer. But Jacob had wanted more than that. He wanted freedom without responsibility, success without effort, and when he didn't get it, he turned his back on the one person who had always been there for him. Martin knew it was time to move forward. He couldn't keep looking back. His decision to cut ties with Jacob was final. There would be no redemption, no coming back from this. Jacob had made his bed, and now he would have to lie in it. Martin could only hope that one day his son would understand why it had to be this way. For now, Martin focused on his work. The company was running smoothly, and he had no intention of letting anything interfere with that. The employees respected him, his decisions were clear, and he was in control. He had built this business from the ground up, and it wasn't going to fall apart just because of a family dispute. If anything, it was a reminder that he couldn't afford to let anyone, family or otherwise, undermine his vision. As the weeks passed, Martin felt the weight of the decision lifting off his shoulders. There were no more calls from Jacob, no more silent messages left unread. For all he knew, his son had given up completely. Martin had no intention of reaching out, of trying to mend what was broken. It was done. He had done what needed to be done, and that was the end of it. Meanwhile, Jacob's world was collapsing in ways that Martin could never have imagined. Without the support of his father, and without the safety net of his father-in-law's company, Jacob found himself standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the mess he had made. The days after his phone call to Martin were some of the darkest in his life. He had hoped for a lifeline, a chance to fix things, but what he had received was finality. His father had refused to help, and with that, all the illusions he had built up came crashing down. Jacob no longer had the luxury of pretending everything was fine. There were no more calls from Claire asking about his day, no more encouraging words from his father-in-law. He was alone. The weight of his mistakes was crushing. He had made decisions based on pride and ambition, thinking he could handle everything on his own. But now, with his father gone, with Claire slipping further away, Jacob realized that he had lost everything that mattered. He spent hours staring at the walls, unable to move, unable to do anything but replay his life in his mind. How had it all gone so wrong? What had happened to the confident man who thought he could take on the world? He had once believed he could conquer anything, that the world would bend to his will. But now, reality had shown him a much harsher truth. He had been reckless. He had taken everything for granted, the trust of his father, the support of his wife, the opportunities that had been handed to him on a silver platter. Now, none of that mattered. Jacob knew that he couldn't blame anyone else for what had happened. It was all his fault. He had burned bridges with his father, turned his back on the people who had always been there for him. He had chosen the pursuit of wealth and status over the things that truly mattered. And now he had nothing. No career, no family, no future. His father's voice echoed in his mind. You made your bed, Jacob. Now you lie in it. He had thought he could escape the consequences of his actions, but now he realized the truth. There was no running from this, no quick fixes, no easy way out. He had to face what he had done, face the fact that his choices had led him here. There was no one to blame but himself. Jacob tried to reach out to Claire, but she had already made up her mind. She had grown disillusioned with him, and no amount of apologizing, no amount of pleading, could change that. He had failed her, just as he had failed his father, and the damage was irreparable. Their relationship, once full of promise, was now a hollow shell. Claire had moved on, and Jacob was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. With no job, no family, and no support, Jacob was forced to confront the consequences of his own decisions. Every mistake, every misstep, was now laid bare before him, and there was no one left to help him pick up the pieces. He spent the next few weeks in a haze, moving through his days like a ghost, trying to figure out what to do next. He didn't know how to fix what was broken, didn't know where to go from here. But one thing was certain: he couldn't go back. He couldn't undo the past, and he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Jacob was left with nothing but the painful realization that he had created his own downfall. His father's refusal to help had sealed his fate, and now he had to face the consequences of his decisions, alone. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed, his mind a constant whirl of thoughts. The apartment felt emptier than ever. Claire hadn't spoken to him much in the last week, but it wasn't just the silence that was suffocating. It was the coldness, the distance that had crept between them. He could feel it every time she walked past him, every time she avoided eye contact. She had become a stranger to him, and in many ways, he was a stranger to her now. He didn't know how to fix this, didn't know how to undo the damage he had caused. But he had to try. He needed her. The thought of losing Claire, of her slipping further away from him, was unbearable. She had always been his support, his rock, the one person who believed in him when no one else did. But now all that faith had been replaced with doubt. She had seen him at his weakest, and worse, she had seen him fail. She had watched him fall from the pedestal he had so carefully placed himself on, and now she was watching him try to crawl back up. But it was too late. The person he had been wasn't the person she wanted anymore. Jacob knew he couldn't undo his past mistakes, but he could try to show her that he had learned. He could show her that he was still capable of being the man she had once believed in. So, he decided to take the first step. He would talk to her. He would apologize for everything, his arrogance, his mistakes, the way he had taken her for granted. He would tell her that he was willing to change, to do whatever it took to win back her trust. He found Claire in the living room, sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the television. The room was dimly lit, and the silence between them was palpable. Jacob hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he walked toward her, taking a deep breath. "Claire, can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She didn't look up at first, but he could see her shoulders stiffen as if bracing herself for whatever he was going to say. Finally, she turned to face him, her eyes tired and distant. "What is it, Jacob?" Her tone was flat, emotionless. It wasn't the warm, comforting voice he was used to. Jacob swallowed hard. He could feel his throat tighten. The words he wanted to say caught somewhere between his chest and his mouth, but he had to say it. He had to try. "I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you, and I don't know how to make it right. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I've been selfish, and I've taken everything we had for granted." Claire didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, her gaze unwavering, as if trying to decipher whether he was truly sincere or just trying to make amends because he had no other choice. Jacob could see the doubt in her eyes, and it stung. "I don't know how I got to this point," Jacob continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I'm not the man I was when we first met. I've lost myself, and I've lost you in the process. I don't want to lose you forever, Claire. I need you to believe that I'm willing to change, that I want to fix this." Claire sighed, her gaze drifting to the floor. She rubbed her temples, as if the weight of everything had become too much to bear. The silence stretched on, and Jacob felt like he was drowning in it. He waited for her response, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she would offer him a lifeline. But it never came. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Jacob, I've watched you for so long, trying to get everything you wanted without really understanding what it takes to make something work. I've seen you fail, and I've seen you make excuses. I've watched you chase after the wrong things, thinking that success, money, and status would make everything better. But it hasn't. And it's not going to. You can't keep running from the consequences of your actions. Jacob's heart sank. The words she spoke cut deeper than he could have imagined. She wasn't angry. She wasn't yelling. She was simply resigned. Resigned to the fact that things would never go back to the way they were. "I don't want to do this anymore, Jacob," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep waiting for you to figure it out. I can't keep pretending that things are fine when I know they're not. I can't keep being the one who holds everything together while you fall apart. You've hurt me, and I've let you, but I can't keep doing this." Jacob's stomach twisted, his chest tightening with the pain of her words. He could see it in her eyes. She had already made up her mind. He had failed her, and now she was done. "I don't want to be the person who drags you down, Jacob. I can't stay in this with you. Not anymore," Claire said quietly, standing up from the couch and walking toward the door. "I'm leaving." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Jacob stood frozen in place, his mind scrambling for something, anything to stop her. But nothing came. His mind was clouded with the realization that he had pushed her too far. He had let his mistakes define him, and now they were taking everything from him. "No, Claire, please," Jacob pleaded, stepping toward her. "Please don't go. I'll do anything. I'll change. I swear, I just need a chance. Please." But Claire didn't turn around. She stood by the door, her hand on the handle, her back to him. There was no hesitation in her movements, no pause to reconsider. She had already made her choice, and there was nothing Jacob could do to change it. "I've given you enough chances, Jacob," Claire said quietly, her voice breaking just a little. "And I've given you everything I had. But I can't keep doing this. I'm sorry, but I'm done." With that, she stepped out of the apartment, leaving Jacob standing there, staring at the empty space she had just vacated. The silence in the room was deafening. His heart felt hollow, and for the first time in his life, Jacob realized just how alone he truly was. Claire had made her choice. She was choosing her future without him, and Jacob was left to face the consequences of his actions. Alone. The door clicked shut behind her, and Jacob stood there in the silence, unable to move. The woman he had loved, the woman he had thought was his future, was gone, and it was all his fault. The apartment felt like a foreign place now. The quiet seemed more oppressive than ever before, settling over him like a weight he could never lift. The door clicked shut behind Claire, and Jacob was left standing in the middle of the room, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. For a moment he couldn't move. His mind was blank, his thoughts scattered, as if they were in a fog that he couldn't push through. He had tried, or at least he had thought he had, but now everything he had built, everything he had believed in, was slipping through his fingers. It wasn't just Claire. It wasn't just his father. It wasn't just his job. It was everything. The dreams he had once held so tightly to, the ones that kept him moving forward, the ones that told him he could have it all, were gone. Shattered. And in their place was a void, an emptiness that felt impossible to fill. He had spent so many years trying to achieve something bigger, trying to prove himself, but now, in the quiet of his apartment, it felt like all those efforts had been for nothing. He had no job, no future, no family. He had no one. Jacob moved toward the couch, but when he sat down, the comfort he once found in it was gone. There was no escape from the truth. He had lost it all. Every decision he had made, every time he chose ambition over family, had led him to this moment. And now, there was nothing left but the consequences of his actions. There were no second chances, no do-overs. What was once a promising future was now a landscape of broken dreams. He stared at the empty room, his thoughts spiraling. The echo of his father's words rang in his ears. "You made your bed, Jacob. Now you lie in it. His father had been right, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. The weight of his failures crushed him, pressing down on him until he felt like he was suffocating under it. He had been so sure that he could do it on his own, that he could carve out a life for himself, separate from his father's influence. But now he realized that he had underestimated just how much he had relied on the support of others. He picked up his phone, scrolling aimlessly through the contacts, hoping for something, anything, that would offer him a sense of connection. But there was nothing. No messages from Claire, no calls from his father, no friends reaching out to offer a hand. He was alone in every sense of the word. The realization hit him harder than any of the failures he had faced before. There was no safety net anymore. He was on his own. As the hours dragged on, Jacob's sense of defeat deepened. It wasn't just the loss of Claire, the distance from his father. It was the collapse of everything he had worked for. He had spent so many years chasing success, believing that if he could just achieve enough, everything would fall into place. But now, he saw the truth. Success hadn't brought him happiness. It hadn't brought him peace. It had only driven him further from the people who mattered most. And now, all of it had crumbled to dust. He stood up, pacing the apartment, his hands running through his hair in frustration. There had to be something he could do, something that would fix it all. But no matter how hard he tried to think, no solution came to mind. The reality was too harsh to ignore. The life he had built, the life he thought he was entitled to, was gone, and there was no way to get it back. Meanwhile, miles away, Martin continued his life as if nothing had changed. It was almost as if Jacob never existed. After the phone call, after the final words were spoken, Martin had made peace with the decision he had made. He didn't need to look back. He didn't need to dwell on the past. What was done, and there was no room for regret. Martin's company continued to run smoothly. The assets he had worked so hard for remained secure, his legacy intact. His employees respected him, and the business thrived without the distractions that had once plagued it. Jacob's absence, his betrayal, hadn't slowed Martin down in the slightest. If anything, it had made him more resolute, more focused. He had made the hard choice, and now he was moving forward without the weight of his son's mistakes holding him back. In the quiet of his office, Martin sat back in his chair, looking out the window at the city below. The weight of the past few weeks settled over him, but there was no guilt, no lingering doubt. He had done what was necessary, what had to be done. Jacob had chosen his path, and Martin had chosen his. He wasn't going to waste time second-guessing himself or wondering what could have been. He had been a good father, had tried to guide Jacob, to offer him everything he could. But in the end, Jacob had made his own decisions. He had made his bed. And now, as he sat there, Martin felt a sense of peace. It was strange, but it was there. There was no room in his life for reconciliation. Not now, not after everything had unfolded the way it had. Jacob's actions had been clear. His choices had spoken louder than anything Martin could say. And Martin knew deep down that this was the right choice. He couldn't let his son's mistakes drag him down. He couldn't keep rescuing Jacob from the consequences of his actions. It was over. Martin stood up and walked toward his desk, picking up a few papers and organizing them. He had a business to run, a future to build, and that future didn't include the mistakes of the past. He had given Jacob every chance he could, but now it was time to move forward. Meanwhile, Jacob sat in his empty apartment, the weight of his life's collapse pressing down on him. The calls to Claire went unanswered. The emails to his father went unread. And as the days turned into weeks, Jacob felt himself sinking deeper into the isolation that had once seemed so far away. It was as if he had been cut off from everything that had once defined him, and now, with nothing left to hold on to, he was adrift in a sea of his own failures. He knew he couldn't undo what had been done, but the weight of it all was unbearable. And now, With no one to turn to, Jacob was forced to confront the cold, harsh truth of his situation. He had burned every bridge, pushed away everyone who had once cared for him, and now he had no one, no job, no family, no future. His father had moved on, and Jacob was left alone, standing in the wreckage of his own making. The apartment had become a shell, the silence within it more oppressive with each passing day. Jacob had tried, in his own way, to rebuild what had crumbled, to restore what he had lost. But as the days dragged on, the weight of his isolation became undeniable. Without Claire, without his father's support, without the network of people he had once relied on, he was utterly alone. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone in front of him, the screen reflecting his weary face. The temptation to call Claire, to beg her to come back, was there, strong and overwhelming. But he knew it was futile. She had made her decision, and so had his father. There were no more hands reaching out to him, no more offers of help. The reality was clear now. He was on his own. Jacob had always believed that he was capable of handling everything. For years, he had relied on his charm, his ambition, his ability to talk his way into opportunities. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that success would follow him no matter what. But now, sitting in the stillness of the apartment, he realized just how wrong he had been. His father's absence stung, but his own failure hurt even more. His stubbornness, his disregard for his father's advice, had led him to this moment. His decision to reject everything his father had worked for, everything that had been offered to him, had cost him everything. He couldn't blame anyone but himself. He had pushed people away when he should have embraced them. He had chosen the pursuit of wealth, status, and independence over the things that truly mattered. Now, without the support of the people who had always been there for him, he found himself floundering. The business world he had once dominated was now a distant memory. His connections had evaporated, his reputation tarnished. The once promising future he had built on ambition and pride now lay in ruins. And Jacob didn't know how to fix it. It was time to face the consequences of his decisions. He had no one left to lean on. His father wasn't going to come to the rescue. Claire wasn't going to come back. There were no more opportunities waiting for him. He was stuck with the choices he had made, and there was nothing left but to figure out how to move forward. Jacob took a deep breath and stood up. He walked to the window and looked out over the city, the lights below twinkling like a distant dream. It was the same city he had once thought he could conquer, the same city that now felt so alien to him. He had been so sure that everything would fall into place. But now, he saw the reality. Success didn't just come from ambition. It came from relationships, from trust, from hard work, from the ability to acknowledge one's weaknesses. And Jacob had failed to do any of that. He thought about the phone call with his father, the cold finality in Martin's voice. "You made your bed, Jacob. Now you lie in it." Those words had haunted him for days, echoing in his mind, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Martin had been right. Jacob had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. The choice to cut ties with his father had been his own, and now he was the one who had to bear the consequences. But there was still a part of Jacob that refused to give up. He couldn't afford to sit around and wallow in self-pity. He had to make something of himself again. He had to prove that he could rebuild. It wasn't about the money or the status. It was about his pride. It was about showing that he was capable of standing on his own 2 feet, even if it meant starting from scratch. Jacob spent the next few days looking for work. The process was grueling. He sent out resumes, applied to every job he could find, but nothing came through. The responses were few, and the rejection emails stung even more than they used to. He had once been at the top, confident that opportunities would always come his way. But now, with nothing to offer, he was invisible. His savings were running out, and the bills were piling up. The apartment was no longer a refuge. It was a reminder of everything he had lost. He couldn't afford to keep living this way, but there was no way out. He couldn't call his father, couldn't ask for help. He had already burned that bridge. And his father-in-law, well, after the trial period fiasco, there was no way he was going to offer Jacob a second chance. Jacob tried to reach out to his old friends from the business world, but they had all moved on. He had been the one everyone looked to for support, but now they were all too busy with their own lives to care. The people who had once admired him, who had once seen him as a rising star, were no longer interested in his struggles. And why should they be? Jacob had nothing to offer them anymore. As the days turned into weeks, Jacob's sense of isolation deepened. He had tried to make a fresh start, to rebuild his life, but he realized now that the task was too monumental. The connections he had relied on were gone, and the skills he had once used to climb to the top were useless without the resources and relationships that had supported him. The city, which had once seemed full of possibilities, now felt like a cold, indifferent place. But Jacob kept moving forward, even when it felt like he was getting nowhere. Every morning, he woke up and tried again. He applied for more jobs, attended more interviews, but the results were always the same. No one was interested in him. The realization that he had burned all his bridges, that he had no one left to turn to, slowly ate away at him. Finally, Jacob realized what he had known all along, but had refused to acknowledge. He was alone. His choices, his stubbornness, had brought him to this point. He had alienated the people who cared about him, and now he had no one left. His father was gone. Claire was gone. His former colleagues had moved on, and Jacob was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer existed. Jacob's new life was one of solitude. He had no support, no financial safety net, no relationships to rely on. It was just him, facing the harsh reality of his failures. Every day felt like a struggle, each moment a reminder of everything he had lost. And as the days passed, Jacob realized that rebuilding his life wouldn't be as simple as finding a job or making new connections. It was about something much deeper, something he hadn't been willing to acknowledge until now, the need to rebuild himself from the ground up, to rebuild his self-worth, to find a way to move forward without the crutch of his past. For the first time in his life, Jacob understood the full weight of his actions. He had no one to blame but himself. And now he had to find a way to face the consequences, to figure out how to live with them. This was his new life, and it was going to be harder than anything he had ever imagined. The days had blurred into one long stretch of endless effort and failed attempts. Jacob had spent his time in a fog, applying for jobs, sitting in interviews that always led nowhere, and facing rejection after rejection. He had started to feel like a ghost in his own life, his past achievements, his former confidence, all slipping away like sand through his fingers. But even worse than the lack of progress was the sense of utter isolation. Every attempt to reach out, every phone call or message to people he once considered allies, had been ignored or met with indifference. The city that had once felt full of opportunities now felt like a cold, uncaring place. And as Jacob sat alone in his apartment one evening, the weight of it all pressing down on him, one thought kept gnawing at him. He couldn't do this alone anymore. He needed someone. He needed his father. It was a painful thought, one he had been avoiding for weeks. But he couldn't avoid it any longer. His father had always been there for him, even when their relationship had been strained. Martin had tried to guide him, to show him the way, but Jacob had ignored that guidance, believing he knew better. Now, with nothing left, with no resources or options, Jacob realized just how wrong he had been. He grabbed his phone, his hand trembling slightly. His mind raced. What would he say? How could he make his father understand that he was truly sorry, that he had learned from his mistakes? But there was no time to overthink it. He had to do this now, before the darkness of his situation swallowed him whole. Jacob dialed the number, holding his breath as the phone rang. Each ring felt like a hammer to his chest. He didn't know what he expected, but he knew that he couldn't let his pride stand in the way any longer. He needed help. And this was the only way he could think of to get it. The line clicked, and then Martin's voice came through, colder than Jacob had ever remembered it. "Jacob," Martin said, his tone clipped, as if he were already expecting this call. Jacob's throat tightened, the words barely able to form. "Dad, I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking as he tried to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "I need your help. I can't do this anymore. I've lost everything. I don't know how to fix this. Please, I'm asking you, please help me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Jacob's heart pounded as he waited for a response. He could feel the weight of the silence, each second stretching on forever, his hope fading with every moment that passed. Finally, Martin spoke, but his words were not what Jacob had hoped for. "You were wrong, Jacob," Martin replied, his voice emotionless. "But that doesn't change anything. You made your choice. You turned your back on me, on everything I tried to teach you. You said I'm no part of your family anymore, remember?" The words hit Jacob like a physical blow, but he couldn't argue. He had said it. He had told his father that he was no longer part of his life, that he was on his own. Now, he was paying the price for it. The reality of his actions was sinking in, and it was worse than he had imagined. Martin continued, his tone growing colder with each word. "Now, you work in your new big company. You wanted independence, remember? So ask your father-in-law for help. He's the one you admired more, right?" The words were a cruel reminder of everything Jacob had rejected. His own father, the man who had built a life from nothing, who had given him everything, was now the last person he could turn to. It was his fault. He had burned that bridge. He had chosen wealth, status, and independence over the family that had always been there for him. Now, he was reaping the consequences. Jacob's throat tightened, the tears that had been building up finally spilling over. "Please, Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, I don't know what to do anymore. I can't do this by myself. I've lost everything. I'm sorry for everything I said, everything I did. I was wrong." But Martin's response was as cold as ever. "It's too late, Jacob. I'm not going to rescue you. You're on your own now. You've made your bed. Now you lie in it." Jacob's chest ached, the weight of his father's words crashing down on him. The finality in Martin's voice left no room for hope, no space for redemption. There was no going back from this. His father wasn't going to forgive him, and he wasn't going to offer any help. The door that Jacob had once thought was open to him was now firmly closed. "Goodbye, Jacob," Martin said, his voice as indifferent as ever. "You made your choices. Now you live with them." And just like that, the call ended. The line went silent, leaving Jacob sitting in the darkness of his apartment, alone with his thoughts. His phone slipped from his hand, and for a moment he couldn't move. The weight of his failure, the weight of his choices, crushed him from every side. He had lost everything. His father, his wife, his future, all of it had slipped through his fingers. And now, there was no one left to help him. Jacob sat there in silence, his body numb with the realization that there was no way out. His father had made it clear. There would be no second chance, no forgiveness, no rescue. The past few months had been nothing more than a series of mistakes, each one compounding the last, until there was nothing left but the consequences of his actions. The phone call had been his last hope, but it had only confirmed what he already knew. There was no way back. The choices he had made had sealed his fate, and now he had to face it alone. He had been given everything, opportunity, love, guidance, and he had thrown it all away. His stubbornness, his pride, had led him to this point, and there was no undoing it now. The silence in the room was deafening. Jacob's mind raced, but the thoughts were all the same, endless cycles of regret, of missed chances, of roads not taken. He had no one to blame but himself. His father was gone, and with that, the last thread of hope Jacob had held onto had been severed. The truth was undeniable now. Jacob was alone, and he had no one to blame but himself. The story ends abruptly here, with the phone call hanging in the air, the weight of Jacob's failure settling in as he faces the full consequence of his actions. There is no redemption, no resolution, just the cold, harsh reality of the choices he has made.